Okay, so we're back into Deuteronomy this evening. Some of us here, I know, are working through the New Testament over the course of this year. It's been a good experience so far, even if it's not always as easy as it sounds to keep pace. At least we're thinking in our family, at least now we're in Hebrews, which has shorter chapters than Acts, which is helpful. We started the year in the book of Mark, and in that book, Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, and his reply is well known. The two greatest commandments: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, as we're looking at Deuteronomy this evening, I was just thinking that's quite a good summary to have in mind, because the two chapters we're looking at are really just brilliant examples of what does it mean in practice to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. If you want an idea of what that looks like in real life, that's what Deuteronomy 14 to 16 is kind of giving us. Now, the chapter's split into some distinct sections, not all the same length, and as in previous weeks, we'll look at some sort of representative verses from each one. And the first section we're going to look at is this, Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 29, and that is really dealing all about the subject of tithes and tithing. So we'll read verses 22 and 23 to get an idea. So Deuteronomy 14, verse 22. You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And it carries on in a similar vein, with instructions of what you do if you're living too far away to take those things and so on. Now, we're going to have to move quickly because there's various sections to get through, but there are two things that struck me that I wanted to draw our attention to reading about tithing here in Deuteronomy 14. The first thing that stands out is simply this: the tithe is given over to God, but you don't give your tithe to God by releasing it and never seeing it again. How do you give your tithe to God? Well, you take it to the place that God will choose, and when you get there, you eat it with your whole household. So tithing here in Deuteronomy 14 is actually a celebration. It's having a huge feast. Now, we'll come back to that idea later, but it just struck me that you can read a book like Deuteronomy, and you can think that it's full of laws, and in one sense it is. But the fact that it's full of laws does not mean that it is always solemn or formal or somber. And certainly here in Deuteronomy 14, that is not the case. How do you tithe? You get all the thing you're going to offer to God, and when you take it to the place that God sets out, there you have this enormous feast with all your friends, all your family, your entire household. That's how you tithe. Now, the second thing that I thought is interesting is this: trying to think, what is this telling us about why we should tithe? Because that's a really important thing to think through as well. Now, certainly tithing here is a way to provide resources for the needy. That comes out much more clearly in the last couple of verses in that section, verses 28 and 29. So one of the reasons that you tithe is to help provide resources for the needy. Another reason that is implicit in all this, you tithe as an act of thanksgiving. Tithing is taking some of what God has given and returning it to him. So there's an act, tithing is also about returning things back to God, and it's an act of thanksgiving, thanking God for what he has provided. Now, the reason I read the two verses that we did, and you get this later on as well, is there's a third reason that might strike us as something of a puzzle, or at least a curiosity. What is the reason that verse 23 gives for tithing? We tithe because through tithing, or the Jewish people there, that they may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So why tithe? Because through tithing you learn to fear God. Now, does that strike you as slightly odd? When you think about the fear of the Lord, what characteristics of God do you tend to think about? You might more naturally be drawn to God's justice or God's judgment. And if you think about what it means in practice to fear the Lord, you might be more tempted to think about things like awe or reverence or stopping to reflect on both the majesty and severity of God. When you think about how do you learn how to fear God better, well, if you're like me, your mind doesn't immediately jump to, let's have a huge family party. But that is what Deuteronomy 14 is saying. How do you tithe? You tithe by getting all your grain, your wine, your oil, your sheep. You take it to the place the Lord says, and there you have a huge feast. And that is one of the ways you will learn how to fear the Lord. So if that strikes us slightly odd, you kind of have to ask the question, well, how is this supposed to work? How is having an enormous feast for the whole household intended to help us learn how to fear God? Well, remember, first, this isn't just some huge party. It says, eat and drink before the Lord. Verse 23 and 26 both say, you eat and drink before the Lord. So logically, if you're doing something before the Lord, this cannot include kind of drunkenness or immoral behavior. It's not that kind of party. But what is this feast about? I think the idea is that when you stop and feast, you are collectively, as a household, recognizing all that God has done for you. So that the act of stopping and feasting is a proclamation of God's goodness and provision. And you are demonstrating to the entire household, your whole family and household, that fearing the Lord is worth it. Fearing the Lord is not about living in a kind of constant state of worry that God will punish you. Fearing the Lord is not about always being serious and stern as if any kind of amusement is an offense to God's holiness. Fearing the Lord is about placing yourself in the hands of a God who loves you, who cares for you, who wants to provide for you, and a God who actively commands you to experience the joy and laughter of a huge family feast. That is the kind of God that we are supposed to be fearing. And so as you do that, and as they do this and celebrate as a family together, you are declaring all these truths about who God is. And it's a lesson to the whole household that fearing the Lord is worth it. Putting God in first place is worth it. And you do that by feasting together. That is how the tithe is working. Now, I find that helpful in the sense that there's a question that you often get asked in churches, which is this: are Christians supposed to tithe now that we live after the New Testament and not bound by the laws of the Old? Now, I think the answer to that is that the question itself is slightly flawed. I suggest a better question might be that one. How are we as Christians supposed to fulfill the same purposes as those underlying the tithe? So why do the Jews have to tithe? To cultivate and demonstrate compassion for the needs of the poor and the needy. They're supposed to tithe as a way of showing thankfulness to God's provision, to God for his provision, and do that through generosity. And they're supposed to tithe as a way of using celebration and joy and laughter as a way to teach about the fear of the Lord. So if those are the purposes of the tithe, in some ways the question, should we tithe today, can be overtaken by how do we actually today not treat tithing as something that as an obligation, but actually think, what is it that tithing was supposed to do in the people of Israel, and how do we fulfill those purposes today? How can we as churches develop compassion for the needs of the poor? Compassion for the needy? How can we as churches learn to demonstrate thankfulness to God through generosity? How can we use celebration in the life of our church as a way to encourage others to fear God more? Those, I think, are more helpful questions that we can wrestle with, which you won't be surprised to hear we will do in due course as we come to our discussion groups later on. So the first section of these two chapters in Deuteronomy looks at this issue of tithes. Now, as we move into chapter 15, the next section is about release. Two forms of release, although the context for both is quite similar. It's release from debts and the release of bondservants or slaves. We'll come to that in a minute. We'll start with the release of debts. So I'll read a few verses from this section. Start with verses 1 to 5 from Deuteronomy chapter 15. It says this: at the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today. And then verse 7, if among you one of your brothers should become poor, in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. We'll leave it there. Now, this chapter does require a little bit of background to understand what's going on with this release from debt, and also later what's going on with the release from servitude. Israel is on the verge of entering the promised land, which they will conquer and then inhabit. And their life is going to be basically an agricultural one. Most people are going to have that kind of agricultural lifestyle, living from the land that they own. Now, in that context and in that point in time, people's lives could be quite precarious. Insufficient rain, illness, you haven't got enough people in your family, invasion by foreigners. There are all sorts of things that could leave you in quite significant trouble. And remember, there's no social care system here. There's no universal credit you can sign on to receive. So what might you do if your life was so difficult that you were really struggling and finding things hard? Well, one option that you have, there's another option we'll come to in a minute, but one option that you have would be to approach someone who is wealthy and borrow from them, money or animals or grain or whatever it is you need to help keep your household going. And what this passage is saying is after every seventh year, whatever loan had been given out, that should be cancelled and returned to zero, and any kind of property or something given over as a kind of guarantee against that loan should be returned to the person who gave it. Now, that is important to recognize, because I think the loans that are being talked about here are loans that have been given to the poor to help them get by. These are loans given by those who have more resources in life to help those who have fewer resources. And I think that helps us understand why the start of that passage says this does not apply to foreigners. If a foreigner has given you a loan, you don't have to give that back. Because I think what it is saying is foreigners who live in the land are more likely to have been traders. So their loans are not loans given to help get through hard times of poverty. The loans are more likely to be business loans. And so this law is designed to help the struggling poor to get back on their feet. It's not about helping business people, letting them off the hook when it comes time to repay the loan. So what God is saying is, when you have loaned out money to help people who are struggling, to help the poor survive, every seventh year that needs to be written off and forgotten about, and you need to return whatever collateral was given for you. Now, beyond that, God actually sets out in verse 4 the ideal. In verse 4 is that there should be no poor at all, because God will provide enough for everyone. It just needs to be distributed fairly. People often make the same point about the world today. There's sufficient resources for everyone. It just isn't well distributed. However, having said that, the ideal is there should be no poor. God accepts, or seems to accept, that realistically the people have a limited capacity to do what's being asked, and verse 7 accepts there will be poor. Verse 7 there, should there be poor in the land? That doesn't mean that people are innocent of not fulfilling what God has said. And Jeremiah specifically condemns the people of Israel for not fulfilling that. But what God is saying is, when you find the poor, what do you do in that situation? And the solution in that situation is those who are more wealthy have a responsibility to show compassion and concern for those who are in need by loaning out, and by every seventh year writing off those loans. And there's almost the sense in which the passage tries to emphasize the responsibility by the way that people are described. A couple of verses that we read, the person who is needing a loan is described as your neighbor. It goes further than that. In verses 2, 3, 7, 9, 11, and 12, the person is described as your brother. And verse 12 clarifies that brother includes both men and women. So the person that you are lending to, the person in need, this is your brother. You who are more wealthy, you have a relationship. You are living in relationship with the poor. These poor have a legitimate claim to your compassion and to your concern. You have a duty of care towards them. You can't just justify not helping these people because it's their fault or whatever you think. They are your brothers and sisters. You have a duty of care towards them because you are in relationship with them. The passage emphasizes that over and over by this repeated use of saying, this is your brother, it's your brother, it's your brother. This is your own family. And in a sense, the poor have a genuine, legitimate claim that the wealthy should be concerned and compassionate towards them. That is part of what it means to live in community. Now, again, we live in the light of the New Testament, but that does not mean that we are free from some of these same responsibilities. Just a couple of verses to pick out from the New Testament, which reiterate and re-emphasize this same principle. Galatians 6 verse 10, so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Or 1 John 3:17, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in you? You see, it's written to the church. If you see someone who is a brother or sister in Christ, they have need and they're struggling, if you've got the capacity to make a difference and say, well, it's not nothing to do with me, then how can you claim to have God's love in you? That's what John is saying. It's pretty strong language. Those in the church who are doing better financially are instructed to look out for those who might be struggling. Our priority is those in the church, but actually where possible it should extend beyond that. Paul says in Galatians, let us do good to everyone, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Not only to those who are of the household of faith, but especially, that is, starts there, where possible, spreads out from there. Now, that is clearly it's not an easy thing to live out. It's a complicated thing to try and work out in practice. There are no easy answers as to how you are to do that. Help could take various forms. There are food banks, warm spaces that we run in our church, projects like CAP that help people to use their resources more effectively. There are various ways to work this out, and that is not going to be easy to do in practice. What is much clearer is the kind of heart attitude that Deuteronomy is looking for and that the New Testament is looking for as well. It's that attitude of compassion, of care, of concern for the situation of those who are in need. And that kind of compassion and care and concern is a characteristic, an essential characteristic of anyone who claims to follow Christ. That is what Deuteronomy is pushing towards, to have that attitude of heart and mind as you look around to those in the community in that first century context. This is what the New Testament is trying to say to us as well, having that compassion and care and concern for those who might be in need and struggling. Now, as you push into the second part of that chapter, the context is similar. The context is very similar, only things have got worse. So again, you're looking at people who are Hebrews, who have hit hard times, have hit challenging situations and difficulties, and are thinking, well, how do I cope with the struggles of life? One way you can do that is to speak to the wealthy and seek to get a loan from them. But what happens if life is just so hard and so difficult that a loan just can't cut it? That's not enough to deal with the problems that you are facing. Well, one option that you had in that ancient context is to sell yourself or to sell members of your family into servitude. Now, sometimes that is translated slavery. Slavery isn't necessarily the most helpful word here, partly because of the ideas it brings to mind after the living as we do after the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th, 19th centuries. That isn't what this is talking about. Many Bibles, like the ESV that we're using, will have a footnote. My Bible might well have it as well. In mine, there's a footnote in chapter 15 that highlights that the word translated slave can be translated servant because it says in my Bible, it designates a range of social and economic roles. So partly because of the way that we think about slavery now, living after the transatlantic slave trade, slavery isn't necessarily the most helpful word because it was a different kind of servitude. So often you hear people talking about bond servants now. And the idea is simply this, like I say, selling yourself as a bond servant was a legitimate way in that period of history to try and cope with poverty. A family that actually is wealthy, that has sufficient resources to cope with the ups and downs of life, you can sell yourself as a servant to that family. Or you can sell members of your own family as servants to them. And that family now has a responsibility. Their responsibility is to feed and to clothe and to house everybody who is in their household, including their servants. So what it's saying is, if you are in a situation in which life is so hard, you are struggling so much that even a loan from the wealthy person isn't enough to help you survive, you might reach the point where actually allowing yourself or members of your family to become bond servants in the house of someone who is wealthy, that might actually leave them much better off than free but destitute and on the verge of starvation or death. And so when the passage is talking about release after 7 years, after 6 years of service, you release those bond servants into freedom. That is the kind of servant that we are talking about. Now, this does not mean that slavery is a good thing. The Bible is not condoning slavery as a good thing here. What it is saying is there are times in history where it's just better than the alternative. Living as someone in the household, as a servant in the household of someone who can feed you and clothe you and home you and care for you is just better than living free but destitute and on the verge of starvation. However, where this kind of servitude happens, it needs to be carefully controlled, and that is what the passage we're going to be looking at. That's what this passage in chapter 15 says. So we'll look at a few verses here. So Deuteronomy 15 and then verse 12. If your brother, a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. And that's another way of release. After 6 years of service, the bondservant must be released. And again, you have that reminder. This is not just any person. This is your brother or your sister. You're living in community with this person. They may have sold themselves to you, maybe living in your household as a servant, but there's a deeper relationship than just servant-master. And now Deuteronomy starts to reframe the whole concept of servitude. Because after 6 years of service, that person is not just to be released, they are to be released with generous gifts of livestock and food. It's kind of like profit sharing with servants, which was unheard of in that period of time. Now, what's happening is this bond servant is a Hebrew, so they should have land they can go back to and return to. They should have land they can return to cultivate and to work and live from. But having spent 6 years in servitude, they're kind of starting from scratch. So this gift you are to give them as the head of the household is to help them re-establish themselves and get back on their feet again. And that again starts to help us understand why you might not have the same responsibility to foreign servants. This is specifically written about Hebrew men or Hebrew women that have sold themselves into servitude. Why do you not release a foreigner who's been in servitude? Well, remember, again, you're living in Israel. Foreigners do not have any right to own land. So you could release a foreign servant, but actually the risk is without any land to live on, they would find it hard there would be a struggle for them to find their place in society. And the risk is that actually within a year, they might be selling themselves back into servitude again. The idea here is the Hebrew servant has land, you give them this gift, they get back on their feet, and they don't need to go back into servitude. They're surviving on their own. A foreign servant won't have that capacity because they don't have the right to own land in Israel. So instead, what do? Well, the person who bought them must continue to fulfill their responsibility to care and to provide for them. And again, the passage we looked at gives the reasons for this. It's not just the what, but the why. You're to do this because even the owner of the bondservant should know that they have ancestors who were slaves. They were slaves in Egypt. Even if you're in the position of someone who's wealthy and can have slaves, actually, you go back far enough in your line, and you too have slaves in your history. And so you should remember that and show compassion and care to those who are under you. Secondly, because your household has benefited from 6 years of service from this person. And lastly, at the end in verse 18, it reminds them that actually God will bless them for their obedience. So again, just like with the tithing, what this passage is pushing towards is the character and attitude of the person who has bought a bondservant. You're supposed to be a person of compassion and care towards those you have responsibility for. By treating servants well, by releasing them in due time, and by giving them a generous gift as they head out to get them back on their feet again. And when you think this is the attitude that you're striving for, that then helps us understand the second half of that passage that we didn't read, which gives the process by which a slave might choose to remain in the household of the person they have been serving. If the person they've been serving is so generous and so compassionate, and their care is so great, they might actually choose to stay in their service rather than suffer all the kind of ups and downs of life as a free person, but poor. There's a way to do that. But then again kind of presumes that the person who has the servant is so generous and compassionate and gracious in their treatment of others that people are going to want to stay with you. If you want to translate that into modern terms for us, you could almost say this is what any Christian employer or Christian boss is striving for, to be the kind of person who is so compassionate and gracious, caring for others and concerning, that actually people who work for you don't want to leave. That's kind of what you're pitching for. So as we move on from there, the next section is quite a short one, which we won't spend much time on. Just the last few verses of chapter 15 of Deuteronomy talks about the need to set aside the firstborn male animal for God, with that stipulation that this animal should be perfect and without blemish. And it picks up lots of the same ideas we have thought about already. This is just giving up your firstborn male animals is another way of acknowledging that God is the Lord of our lives. God is the Lord of the lives of the people. It speaks to that kind of attitude of generosity that they should have. Willing to give up the first. The first, you don't benefit from it yourself, but you give it up to God. You offer the best to God. You offer to God what is costly. But the twist again is that once more, how do you offer the animal up to God? How do you offer your firstborn up to God? Firstborn animals up to God. You offer it to God by cooking it and eating it with all your family. Again, the way you give your tithe to God of the firstborn animal is to celebrate and have a big meal with your family. You might have thought that you were struggling, that there's no way you can afford to have this kind of celebration, and God says, no, your way of honoring me is to have that celebration, whether you think you can afford it or not, because that's what you do with the firstborn animal. You give it to God, and he says the way that you celebrate is to have a feast as an act of thanksgiving. It's a kind of a cycle that the generosity that God requires of his people, that the willingness to give to him, is just a reflection of God's generosity to us. The generosity God wants us to have is a reflection of the generosity that God has shown to us. And so that's how he works this out. You give your firstborn animal to God and say, this is yours. You gave this to me, and so I give it to you. And God says, thanks for that. Eat it as a big feast with your family. That's a beautiful image. Okay, we hit Deuteronomy 16, which is the third chapter that we're working in. And when we come to Deuteronomy 16, this last section covers the three principal festivals of the year for which pilgrimage had to be made. So in verse 1 to 8 there, the first of those three festivals is the festival of Passover and unleavened bread. So Passover is a single day, unleavened bread is 7 days. It's all kind of squashed together as treated as effectively as one festival. The second is the Feast of Weeks, which is also Pentecost, and the third is the Feast of Booths, which is also known as Tabernacles. And these three are all what are known as the pilgrimage festivals, since the people had to travel to a central location. In the passage, it just talks about the place that God will show you. But the people have to travel to a centralized location to celebrate. We saw that before with the tithes. Now, that is probably simply a way of ensuring that the worship that takes place in the way that God requires. If the people were left to do it wherever they were, scattered all across the country, there'd be plenty of opportunity for kind of corrupt practices to creep in, as you see in the history of Israel afterwards. So God centralizes it. You have to come to this central place. And these three festivals were the three festivals of pilgrimage, where you were required to go to that location. Again, we'll just read a short section. This is Deuteronomy 16, verse 13. So we're jumping down to the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. So Deuteronomy 16, verse 13. You shall keep the Feast of Booths 7 days. When you have gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and your winepress, you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns. For 7 days you shall keep the feast to the Lord your God at the place that the Lord will choose, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be together, so that you will be altogether joyful. So these three festivals kind of celebrate two different things. Firstly, they're all connected in some way with the harvest. So here in verse 13, you keep the Feast of Booths when you've gathered in the produce from your threshing floor. So Tabernacles marks the end of harvest time. Passover and the Feast of Weeks mark the start of the harvest time. So all these festivals are linked to harvest. Secondly, they also celebrate at the same time God's work of bringing the people into existence as a people, bringing them out of Egypt into the promised land. So we think what that involves. They were slaves in Egypt. God has taken them into the promised land and given them a land that they can grow and where they can harvest. So you are celebrating both things at the same time. You are celebrating the freedom that you have because of what God did in Egypt, the ability you even have to harvest because God's given you a land, and now you are celebrating the harvest that you have got this year. And obviously thankfulness is key to both of those two elements. You're thankful to God for his faithfulness, both in the past and also in the present. Now, the thing that strikes me that I love about the way this is structured is you have this dual purpose in the festivals. It's this really clever way of connecting together the everyday life of the people, preparing the ground for harvest, sowing, and then harvesting. That's part of in an agricultural society, that's part of everyday life. You're connecting the everyday life of the people with these foundational truths about themselves. And again, it's all about feasting. The way you celebrate this is in great part with food and feasting, getting together with your family, but it's specifically in the case of this passage that you read here, not just your family, but you're to include verse 14, your son, your daughter, family, fine, also your male servants and your female servants. Also the Levites who dedicate themselves to temple service and so don't work the land. The sojourner, that is the non-Hebrew who has chosen to live in Israel. The fatherless and the widow, those who've got no resources for themselves. This is to be a fully inclusive ceremony. Everybody is entitled to participate in this festival. Even if you're not a Hebrew, you're a foreigner living in the land, you still have a right to participate. And the way that is going to happen, obviously, is going to be because those who are wealthy and can afford it have to provide so that everyone can do it. You're not just supposed to just sit back and say, okay, well, those who are poor, they should have saved more during the year. If they can't participate, it's their fault. It's not it. It's the community. Everyone has a right to celebrate in this, which implies those who have more resources have a responsibility to provide for those who don't. And it's feasting. And joy is actually required in this. Verses 11, 14, and 15. You are required to be joyful at this time. Now, that's not to say that you're supposed to be happy all the while. It's that you are supposed to reflect on the grace of God in life. You're supposed to reflect in all the ways that God has provided for you. Even if life is hard right now, the fact you are a people, the fact the Hebrews are in existence as an independent people is because God has been faithful in the past. And as you reflect on the grace of God in life, that brings you to the point that you can celebrate these things, celebrate what's happened in the past and the present, and it should be a source of joy. And so God says in Deuteronomy 16, be joyful. You shall be joyful. It's a command. It's, again, striking as you read it. And again, trying to think, okay, so how do we get from Deuteronomy 16 to where we are now? We don't keep any of these festivals, but again, the question we have to ask is maybe what is the purpose behind them? So although we're not looking to keep the letter of these laws, we might start to think, how can we fulfill the purpose of what these festivals were given for? Well, what we are commanded to keep is obviously the breaking of bread, the Lord's Supper. And that has a purpose of reminding us of what God has done for us and reminding us that Jesus' sacrifice, that is the source of our life, of our identity as the church. And so it's central to our church life, as it should be. However, it also leaves me wondering whether, are there other things we could do, not instead of the Lord's Supper, we need to do that because that's fulfilling what the New Testament is telling us, but are there things we could do as well as, that might also help us to build our sense of identity, to wrap in the kind of everyday life the way that Harvest does, and give us opportunities to reflect on God's faithfulness and to celebrate together and to build a sense of unity and community among us, as these festivals would have done. One example, just from our own experience, when we lived in Peru, sorry if I refer to this too often, but one thing we found in Peru, every church in Peru knew the date it was planted and the year. And every church celebrates their anniversary. So this is some images from our old church last year, 8th of October. That was still in my head even now. That's the anniversary of the church. And every year on the church anniversary, you have a whole weekend of events. You have special services. You have invited guests from all the different churches around and about. You culminate on the Sunday with a huge meal that everyone shares together. And the whole event of the church anniversary becomes this celebration. We spend time together, remember how the church was planted. We thank God for all the people that have played a part in the life of the church. How has the church got to 29 years to this point? How has that 29 years mapped out, the people that have come and gone in that time? And clearly every church has their ups and downs, and there were times when we celebrated a church anniversary with a sense of sadness because of people who were no longer with us, people who had passed away during that year. And you're reflecting on the life that they had lived and how they had contributed at the same time as remembering they're no longer with us. But even in times of loss, it still seemed to become one of the most joyful times of the year as a church, because you're reflecting together on how have we got to this point? What has God done to bring us to the point we're at now? And it kind of knitted us together as a church. All the things that people who've been in the church for 29 years are sharing stories from years past. And those that are joined this year get to hear, okay, so this is what our church is. This is our shared history that is part of who we are. And I found I still look back now, even now, someone's got invites to go back to Peru and share in church anniversaries. It was always a standout part of the year. Again, not to replace the breaking of bread, that was a weekly practice in our church, but just other things that we can do that allow us to celebrate together, reflect on God's faithfulness and God's goodness, and build that sense of kind of unity and community. Are there ways, I'm not saying we have to do that here as well, but are there things we could do? I don't know. That's for us to reflect on and think through. But that's one thing that is a common practice in other parts of the world. Now, that is our section, second half of Deuteronomy 14, all the way through 15 into 16. And just reflecting back on all those things, I think there's a couple of principles that you can see over and over again throughout this whole section. First is this whole idea of thanksgiving and celebration. Tithes and festivals, these are not supposed to be things that are burdensome or somber or solemn. These are supposed to be times of celebration. God has been generous to his people, and they respond to God in thanksgiving. But thanksgiving isn't this kind of staid, stern, somber thing. Thanksgiving in context of these chapters means eating and feasting with the rest of the community. That's how you show thanksgiving to God. You celebrate and you are joyful. And for us today, I guess that is the challenge. Well, the church can and should be a place where we can be honest about our struggles and share the low points in our lives. It should also be a place where the joy of the Lord is evidenced. We worship together, we study together, we talk together, we eat together, we give thanks together, and there should be that sense of joy and celebration as part of the life of the church. We live in a world which increasingly lacks joy. We look at the news and it's more and more creates stress and anxiety. The church should be a place where we recognize God's goodness and we can give thanks and be joyful and celebrate. Celebration is supposed to be a part of being the people of God. And the second thing that goes with that is clearly this one, that idea of generosity. And one of the images that you get all the way through chapter 15 is this brilliant image of being open-handed. You start by recognizing that everything we have is given by God. He's the source of all the resources we have, whatever those are, physical, economic, emotional, practical, whatever. And then the definition, in a sense, of greed is thinking that everything God has put into your hands is for you. It's to receive from God and close your hands and to say, this is mine. But the definition that Deuteronomy gives us of generosity is being open-handed. It's to have your hands open. God gives to us, places into our hands, and you leave your hands open, ready for God to take back from us, or offering it back up to God. It's about that kind of attitude towards we have of all that God's given us, that willingness to release these things back into God's service. It's a compassion and concern that makes you want to use what you have for the benefit of those who have less. And so in a sense, the broad challenge across all these chapters is to reflect on all that God's put into our hands and then to ask ourselves, what are we doing with these things? Whatever God's given to us, to be generous with those, and especially in response to the needs of those who have less. And generosity here is receiving from God and leaving your hands open for God to ask you to pass that on to others, to bless others, that money, time, energy, whatever the resource that God has given to you. And when we are generous in that way, we are living out the image of God in us, because we are acting like a God who is generous beyond what we can imagine. And as that cycle continues, as we are generous to others, we give them reason to give thanks to God and to celebrate for what God has done for them through us. And there's a sense in which that idea of receiving from God with open hands, ready to give back to him and have him say, this needs to go there. That is the essence of these 3 chapters. Understand all you've received from God, thank him for it, celebrate it, and then generously release it back to God for his use, especially when that is driven by the compassion that we have for those in need. Let's pray, and then we'll have reflect on some of the questions that spring out of these chapters. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your immense generosity to us, especially for the giving of Christ that brings us into your family, but also for your ongoing generosity in so many ways, the resources you have given to us, the time, energy, physical resources, emotional, practical, spiritual, all the things that you heap into our lives, whether we understand and realize that or not. And we ask that you'd help us to receive with open hands, willing to release back to you and to pass on to others where you ask us to. Please give us that attitude of heart that is hearts filled with compassion and care and concern for others who have fewer resources than we do, and willing to release our resources into their hands to care for them, and in that way act like you, who gives resources that we don't deserve or even ask for at times. Please will you soften our hearts, help us to be generous, open-handed, joyful, celebratory people as we live in a world that so often lacks all of these things. So we ask that you help us and guide us and reshape us. So we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.